Have you ever wondered how you can wrap your head around everything that's going on in the world today? From Russia carrying out its special military operation in Ukraine to US foreign policy addressing the rise of China? Let's go a step further from that. What if you could distinguish the key events happening from all the noise and distractions? For instance, you could argue that domestic elections in the US are just a racket. Those elections are inconsequential to how the US will behave in the international system. At the same time, you might figure that the major key events happening right now is the US's foreign policy regarding Israel and Ukraine. Lastly, what if you could develop a theory or a method to explain key events that are ongoing and have yet to unfold? Studying these sorts of questions regarding the behavior of states in the international system is called international relations, or IR for short, which is a subfield of political science. This is a field that is unique because it employs political and historical studies, both empirical and normative or moral assumptions, in order to generate theories and methods to help us understand the causes and consequences of events happening at the state level. Now that's a mouthful, but in short, international relations theories help us in practical ways to explain why things are happening the way they are, how states manage relations and their interactions with others, and also to argue the way things ought to be. Where did IR come from? Let's start with Thucydides. Now, Thucydides was a Greek historian who commented on the conflict between Greek states during the Peloponnesian War. He is famous for recounting the Melian dialogue. He is credited as developing the concept of power politics and having both a pessimistic and realistic view of human nature. That natural law would have that the strong will have dominion over the weak, and the possession of capital enables the powerful to reduce the smaller to subjection. Now, some people like to skip ahead from Thucydides all the way to the modern era of thinkers, but we're going to take a moment to acknowledge the contributions made by the Catholic Church, which pretty much laid the groundwork for international politics and modern international relations theories between the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages all the way to the modern era and beyond. From its inception over 2,000 years ago, it has played an instrumental role in the development of modern IR. The Church is responsible for taking Europe out of the Dark Ages and into the prosperity of the Middle Ages. Sort of the main characteristics of the Dark Ages following the fall of Rome is that the infrastructure in Europe had practically fallen apart, and so education and literacy was not available to people the way it had been previously under the Roman administration. Basically, by the time Rome had fallen, it had already been so corrupt in its bureaucracy and administration that it had become ineffectual anyways. So this left a huge void across the Western world. Thankfully, the Catholic Church was there to fill, because they not only were responsible for civilizing the barbarian tribes across Europe into proper nations, such as the Franks, the Anglos, Saxons, Celts, and Nords through missionary work, but they also preserved good aspects of the Roman Empire while cultivating Christianity as the common good for all men. Beyond the Dark Ages, and especially during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was the single most influential institution for centuries in conducting diplomacy and guiding heads of state across Christian Europe and beyond. Even in modern times, so 1500 AD and beyond, the church still plays a central role in international politics. So then, how would we define the church in international relations? It's an institution, right? So the Catholic Church is a trans-governmental organization, meaning it is a key actor that has been involved in shaping international relations between European states and beyond by promoting peace, universal values, understanding, and cooperation between nations. Notably, the Catholic Church has the longest track record in history for providing humanitarian aid, as numerous orders were created specifically to support the poor, people affected by conflicts, and natural disasters. The last important point I think worth mentioning is that many church fathers and church doctors, now, when I say the word doctors, the word doctor means teacher. So they're not church doctors as in physicians, but they are church teachers who wrote extensively on international relations and international politics by not only preserving the customs of the past, even the pagan past of Greece and Rome, but they also were further advancing those concepts over time and Christianizing them. A good example of that would be St. Augustine, who is considered the father of just war doctrine, and St. Thomas Aquinas, who further brought that to light. This is a series of rules for war that are still largely in effect today. That's where we get our laws for going to war and laws in war. Now we're going to get a little bit closer to the modern conceptualization of IR. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at Thomas Hobbes, who is considered a founder of realism, or even the father of realism. His view of human nature posits that man will put his own needs above others to ensure his own security, and that you cannot expect to be helped or to rely on others. So he assumes that human nature is intrinsically self-interested. This is a very important point to note because it, in some ways, is similar to Thucydides in that the strong should rule the weak, but it's more than that because now he's talking about human nature as self-interested. If you take both of those ideas, these are sort of the ground level thought which is fundamental to realism. So modern IR more or less officially emerged after World War I. And it started with this theory called idealism. Idealism was shortly overshadowed by realism, but it's worth mentioning because it started with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which are a set of principles for peace, self-determination, national sovereignty, and collective security. He believed that international relations ought to be guided by moral principles, including justice, equality, and human rights. Now, for me, I kind of look at this as liberalism light, because really a lot of these ideas were more fleshed out in the liberal school of thought, especially the sort of principles of equality and human rights being core pillars of liberalism. Another core theme to his argument is that international cooperation is absolutely essential to promote peace and security. Here's where we see the sort of where they get their name, idealism. And so it's sort of that this notion of international cooperation being ideal and almost utopian in essence, because states don't tend to get along. They have a lot of differences, and that's why they go to war a lot. That's where realism really starts to push back against the idealism theory. Idealism also argues for universal principles and values to guide international relations rather than national interests or power. And I think this point is actually the most interesting part of idealism because I think it's often the most overlooked. The reason being is throughout the Middle Ages, as I said, the Catholic Church played a core role in international politics, and the Catholic Church is by definition a institution that preaches universal principles and values. And what did they do with that? Well, they, for the most part, did guide international relations. And so when realists say that this is sort of utopian or ideal, perhaps in the current state of affairs, it's ideal and utopian because it'd be hard to imagine that happening again. But at the same time, the normative stance one might take towards that, especially those of the Catholic persuasion, is that really international relations ought to be guided by Catholic universal principles and values. So as I said, idealism didn't really hang around too long because it quickly was overshadowed by realism. And so that brings me to realism. What is that? Realism was pretty much, as I said, fleshed out by Thucydides and Hobbes, but it had never been made a formal modern IR theory until E.H. Carr came along. He was a liberal socialist sympathizer. He supported the Soviet Union and advocated for an Anglo-Soviet alliance before and after World War II. He was also critical of the League of Nations after World War I and became staunchly against the League in a series of lectures claiming it to be ineffective. And he also argued that states are too concerned about power than to adhere to moral principles. And again, with the secular states, this is absolutely true. They are not guided by moral principles. And so an idealist international relations system wouldn't work if you don't have states that are concerned with morality. If they don't have that concern, then they are going to seek power and they're going to not trust one another because there really is no authority above states by which to regulate them and to guide them and assist them. One of the core ideas that came out of realism is this assumption of anarchy. And so anarchy is this concept in the world that, and in the international system, that there is no world policeman. There's no central government overarching states. There's no international law enforcement. So if a state is in trouble, it can't call 911. It's kind of on its own. It has to help itself. And so it's worth noting here that before the rise of the modern secular states, European nations in the pre-modern era would have had the church to turn to for guidance and for help even. The church garnered major temporal power and was vastly influential in determining outcomes to political questions. In fact, the church had a long track record for threatening excommunication if kings acted out of line against the common good, whether it was in domestic politics or in its diplomatic affairs with other states. And the church would often settle disputes between kingdoms. Now, in pre-modern Europe, European leaders feared the church, which is the bride of Christ, and thus they feared God. This placed enormous responsibility on them to behave in accordance with the precepts of the church, to remain in good moral standing under God, and also to their subjects who also accepted these moral precepts. There's major accountability here and still a very strong sense of the common good above all else. That is absent in the modern secular state. So there are three major schools of thought in international relations. You have the rational school, social constructivism, and the reflective school. Now, if you want to think about this as sort of categories, you have rational school on this side, you have reflective school on this side. So rational is trying to explain the way things are and really explaining the causes and consequences of state interaction in the international system. Whereas the reflective school is taking a look at how things ought to be. So they're making normative moral assumptions and saying, this is how things ought to be. I'm not going to get too much into the social constructivist or reflective schools because they are not as prominent in IR. Social constructivism is arguably more so than any of the reflective schools, but you have basically in the rational school, you have liberalism and realism. And you also have neoliberalism and neo-realism and sort of all of their subsidiary schools of thought like structuralism and defensive realism, and you have institutionalism. So there's a whole bunch of isms, but the main ones here are liberalism and realism. And there's different types of liberalism and realism. Whereas in the reflective school, you have the English school and a bunch of others that are arguing on how things ought to be in the international system. So you might be wondering, well, where's idealism now? And basically, it got wiped off the board, and that's largely in part because the most well-recognized school of idealism, which was liberal idealism, basically just became liberalism in IR. So that being said, I've already mentioned that the prominent theories here are realism and liberalism. So realism in a nutshell stipulates that states must prioritize survival in a self-help, anarchical world. States will put their own national interest of survival above others, so other states are not to be trusted and must ensure their own security. They can't expect to be helped or to rely on others. Whereas liberalism in a nutshell is that interdependence and cooperation will lead to perpetual peace. Now, the rational theories are more prominent, like I said, because they have more explaining power. They seek to explain the way things are. They're more empirical and they're more objective, rather than the reflective school, which is subjective. And it's also worth noting that IR is different than political theory, as it's simpler and more practical for understanding and answering big questions at the state level of analysis. Political theory is more focused on political ideas and concepts that surround broad political thought and action. So it examines things below the state level, such as individuals and human nature, whereas IR is focused on the causes and consequences, on the interactions between states in a practical, quantitative way, while political theory explores broader ideas and concepts that shape political thought. So to sum up, I would say there's sort of two main outcomes that make IR worth studying. And the first is that there's those who will focus on what causes things and why things are happening the way they are. And on that path, they can focus purely intellectually and go about the academic path of studying and researching in IR. Or there is the focus on how things function in IR and in international politics, so that you could get in there as a diplomat and do things better than what is being done now. And so that would be the career path of becoming a statesman and a decision maker, as opposed to purely intellectual pursuit of understanding. Why is it worth studying? IR is worth studying because it can be used to answer really big questions going on in the world. So for example, are liberal democratic states more likely to be peaceful than authoritarian states? Is the war in Ukraine the West's fault? Does global trade help foster global security? And is GDP a reliable metric to determine the health or status of a state in relation to others? These questions are answered by using theories and methods, which leads me to my second point, that is, it helps develop transferable skills and career options, such as critical thinking, logic, negotiation, diplomacy, problem solving, writing, researching, and analysis. Another thing that makes IR worth studying is it can really help us understand the nature of man better at the state level. It can help us understand social behaviors that are tied to culture and identity. So I've made a list of 4 common problems with IR. The first is that it's actually pretty bad at predicting anything. They're not made to predict, they are made to explain or to argue. They're not really good at predicting future outcomes, even though they may conduct quantitative analysis and they rely on empirical observation. Because they are so narrow-minded and you're only working with a few variables at a time, because otherwise it's too complex. They don't really have predicting power because there's so many outliers in the world that you can't possibly take account of in a theory. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily a drawback, but it's something to be aware of. The second thing is that each theory is relatively simple it is making difficult, complex things very parsimonious to the viewer. And so when you simplify things, the pro is you're going to understand it more and you're going to be able to speak a lot about it. But the downside is that these complex and nuanced issues can't really fully be dealt with insofar as the limitations of each theory, because each theory focuses on some variables and they ignore others. And depending on the situation, if a realist is talking about the effects of globalization, they're going to have a lot less to say about that than a liberal. Now, the third is that, in my opinion, the theories have not really adapted to dealing with contemporary global problems. The thinking for realism and liberalism is somewhat antiquated, as they don't really tell the full story going on in the world today. And I think that has largely to do with the fact that states are no longer as powerful as they once were. Now that you have competing NGOs, international organizations, and multinational corporations in the mix, as well as a myriad of other sort of international conglomerates, they have a lot of power over states in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to controlling the economy. There are interest groups that control the money in countries. And so these forces really have the state at its knees, which has never happened before in the world at this scale. And I think that this is causing a major shift in how we conceptualize states in relation to the broader international system. Now it's no longer that states are the top dog. It's that you have all these other entities that are either on the state level or above it. And I think that's where maybe liberalism addresses these forces a little bit better. But even still, it doesn't tell the full story. And my fourth point is that all established theories in the field of IR operate on more or less a liberal or Marxist assumption or way of thinking. So realism to me has sort of this Marxist edge where the primary focus is solely on power. It's states pursuing power as an end in itself, and that state relations are this power struggle. Liberalism, on the other hand, makes these assumptions that global institutions and secular authorities, and even just the individual, can be the moral arbiters of state interactions and successfully social engineer states to comply with dubious international laws and norms. For example, the idea that making all states into liberal democracies by the barrel of a gun is somehow a good thing. I don't know how well that's working out for you. Why do I study IR? Now, I'm going to make a reference to St. Thomas to describe how I see the world in relation to IR. And St. Thomas says that God is the ultimate cause. And we know that because something can't come from nothing. And so this is one of those age-old questions is, some people believe in the Big Bang and they believe in evolution. Whereas I believe because God is the creator, we have to play by his rules. God gave us the concept of nations. God gave us our intellects, and he gave us our abilities to organize ourselves. And he is ultimately in charge of and responsible for the leaders we have. God ordains and allows certain people into positions of power, even if they're wicked people. Sometimes it's to chastise us because we deserve wicked leaders. And sometimes not often, but sometimes we get really good leaders. This is a natural benefit of when we live in accordance to God, then we are going to get good leaders. And all that is to say that all authority is given from God. And if you look at the world through that lens, it helps a lot of things make sense. And it actually does help explain a lot of things that are going on from a spiritual level, but also a temporal level, because how people are spiritually in relation to God and to the degree they've attained virtue is going to have an effect on the competency and the goodness of the leaders, the states. So the reason I kind of take this understanding of all authority coming from God and the concept of nations being given to us from God helps me to get very objective about my approach and to figure out a way to discern right from wrong and good from evil and what's important versus what's not important in international relations. A lot of the big questions are, which variables and are worth acknowledging to explain things that are happening in the world, and what are the key events. And I think the more objective you get about knowing the good and evil and the spiritual battle that's going on that underpins all of international relations, the better understanding you're going to have at all levels of what's going on. It'll help explain things better. It'll help you understand better what's actually happening in the world and seeing it for what it is. So I'm going to finish this video by talking about where do I fit in to IR. And I'm still figuring that out. I'm looking to develop a Christian moral theory that equally does a good job of explaining what's happening in the world today in plain and simple language, but can also be used to argue how things ought to be. So I suppose this theory would likely borrow from a bunch of already existing theories out there, and probably would borrow from realism and liberalism to the degree that they are relevant in explaining a lot of the big things happening in the world. Liberalism talks a lot about global institutions and globalization, and I think that's a conversation worth having because they're real forces that you can't really ignore. Just as with realism, we can't ignore that in absence of God, the international system truly is anarchic, and states are vying for power to some degree. The structure of the international system as it's been designed does in large part explain how states behave. So the claim that states live in an anarchic system, which basically means there's no higher temporal authority that states can turn to, is a result of secular modern states rejecting the church and rejecting Christianity, because the international system was not like that in pre-modern Europe, or at least to a far lesser degree. And finally, the just war aspect, the aspect of war and peace as integral to the study of IR. I look at war as war can be, sometimes it's chastisement, but sometimes it is the righteous act to make to punish evildoers. With peace, sometimes you have a just peace, you have a good peace, and it is rightly ordered. And sometimes you have peace that is oppressive, and it is worse than if you were at war. There's some times of peace in the world that really cried out for war to make things right, because sometimes, at the end of the day, all ideas are backed by violence. And, that's why you have the US getting involved in Israel and Ukraine, and you have Russia fighting against Ukraine, and you have China rising up, is because all of these states, their modus operandi is the ideas that formulate their cultures and their identities. And those ideas are what almost dictates where these nations are headed. Understanding these aspects tell us a lot about the way we live, the way the world is, and helps us to make sense of things.